Hello, Daniel Yuck here. Thank you for tuning in today. I appreciate you. Within this video, I'm going to share with you how I go about stipple with pepper shading on human skin. By the end of this video, you will be well acquainted and know how I go about doing this process on your end. Be sure to stick around until the end of the video. If you have any questions at any point throughout this video, I'm going to encourage you to drop a comment down below. I will do my absolute best to assist you in the best possible direction. Please don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel and ring that bell for me, as I am going to be bringing more videos like this for you all. I do have social medias under the same name as this YouTube channel. I have Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok, all under Daniel Yuck. I would truly appreciate the support over there as well. If you enjoy my channel or find my content helpful, consider becoming a Patreon or sending over a super thanks, as I would greatly appreciate your support. With that being said, let's dive straight on into this. For this entire demonstration, I'm going to be using this Inkclaw Bug Pen 3-round liner along with the Inkclaw More Money tattoo machine and the Inkclaw Grip for cartridges. I will leave links for you in the description below to the gear that I am using here in this video. I'm also using Spirit stencil paper for the tattoo stencil, and I printed that stencil with a thermal printer. Before we get into the actual tattooing process, I am also using Inky's ointment to moisten the skin before applying the tattoo, and I'm also using a dynamic pre-made gray wash set. Starting from the very top here, my voltage is running at 4 volts. This is going to vary depending on the setup that you are using, but for this specific tattoo that you see me doing here, I'm running at 4 volts even, and I'm using the 60% gray wash right now. A couple of things here. I'm running at a lower voltage so that way I have more time to work on the skin. For me personally, I don't feel there is a set number of passes that we have to go over the skin. I really do feel that the number of passes that we have to go over a skin is all going to be determined by the technical application from the artist. So let's say if we have an artist that runs around 7 to 8 volts, they have to move a lot quicker so that way they're applying their shading without causing too much trauma to the skin. So this is going to be subjective. For me personally, I would rather be able to work on the skin for a longer period of time, so that way I can build up smooth gradients in my shading. Since I'm running at a lower voltage and I'm using the very tip of my needle, I'm not really focused and or really worried about overworking the skin. I feel more comfortable and confident just layering very light touches of pigment over one another to accomplish a certain gradient and tone that I'm trying to reach. I've been working and layering in this area for about maybe 3 to 4 layers now, and you can see that I'm experiencing little to no swelling and very little redness. We'll touch base on shading placement in another video. For this video, I want to focus on the technical application, and I want to try to relay my logic, my thought process, and my approach that I take to apply stipple with pepper shading to human skin. And I want to try to give as much secrets as I can within this video. So again, be sure to stick around until the end. I feel the idea is to align the hand speed and voltage so that way every single line that we input, all of the dots and stipples are lining up close to one another. I'm not saying that they have to be exact or right on point, but what I am saying is we want to have a good idea as to how fast we should be moving with our hand speed and voltage. Another thing that I really focus on is that tip of my needle. I'm always just using the very tip of my needle so that I can use brush-like motions to apply this sort of shading to human skin. I just want to point out that shading is nothing like lining. So when it comes to shading, we don't necessarily want to approach it the same way we would when we're lining. There is in fact a completely different approach, and I feel a better way to go about shading. I feel a good way to go about shading and to look at shading is look at shading as layering. To get a certain transition and to get smoothness and to get certain tones from our shading, we have to layer. Going back to the dynamic pre-made gray wash set, there is a 20% which is the lightest tone, there is a 40% which is in the middle, we have another 60% which is also in the middle, and then we have an 80% which is the darkest. So it has 20, 40, 60, 80, 20 being the lightest, 80 being the darkest. So I'll typically like to start with a lighter tone, and then from there I'll kind of define my boundaries and figure out where I want my darkest points to start from, and then I'll start in those areas and I'll kind of just start building up to the darkest point. Right here is a perfect example of what I'm trying to say when I'm talking about establishing my boundaries. So right here I have an area that I'm not going to go past, and right here where my needle is initially touching down is going to be the darkest point, and where I'm whipping out to is going to be the lightest. And this process is essentially the entire process that I am using to place down my darker and lighter areas on this specific rose right here. I just do this on different sections throughout the entire tattoo that's close and matching to the reference. So once I've identified the boundary and understood where I want to place my darkest point, I'm going to begin to start there. So wherever the needle initially touches down is going to be the darkest area. Where I'm whipping out to is going to be the lightest. You can see that all of these lines neighboring each other are pretty close to one another. Although the dots and pixels aren't matching up exactly alike, I'm still getting a smooth shading going on here because the pixels are consistent and alike towards one another. All of my pixels are at the same depth, which makes them the same size and saturation, and all of the pixels are nice and spaced evenly, which allows me to get a smoother look to my shading. And again, I really feel if we look at shading as layering as opposed to, you know, something like lining, we can get a better technical approach and maybe even get a better understanding as to how we should be properly shading. Shading is a delicate process that requires patience and the right technical application. You can see here that sometime later, I'm still working on this part of the design, and I've gone over this area maybe a couple to a few times already. I don't really keep track of how many times I go over an area. I more so keep my eyes on the skin. I'm always reading the skin. If I'm seeing a lot of redness and swelling, then I may want to change up the technical way that I'm applying the tattoo and or move on to a different area. So for whatever it's worth, try not to make the focus overworking the skin, and especially if you're familiar with using the tip of the needle and brush like motions, and especially if you're working at a lower voltage, try not to work from the headspace of constantly thinking about overworking. Kind of just use your eyes and watch the skin as you go. It's going to be really hard to overlook overworked skin. If we're at a stage where we are nervous about shading on human skin, without a doubt, the best way to go about getting familiar and becoming more comfortable with shading on human skin is to shade on fake skin. Once you learn the technical application and technical approach on fake skin, all of those fundamentals and rules that you learn on fake skin will translate well over to human skin. And I know this by firsthand experience. I will leave links for you in the description below so you can check out some good quality fake skins on your end. I think by now, if I was overworking the skin or if my technique was improper, I would have seen and experienced a lot more redness and swelling and maybe even more blood than I am experiencing now. As of right now in this tattoo session, I have yet to experience any blood or anything like that, which is a good thing. Let's say if I was at a higher voltage or my hand speed wasn't aligned to my voltage, and let's say if I was going a little bit too deep, then I am sure by now I would have already been causing trauma and damage to the skin in ways that would have shown us swelling, redness, and maybe even some bleeding. After adding a couple of more layers, you can start seeing some redness going on there and a little bit of bleeding in certain areas, and this is what it looks like when we begin to start working the skin. Now keep in mind, going back to when I said it's kind of hard to overlook skin that is being overworked, you can obviously see that on the top part right there, that where I'm not shading, there is little red marks there, and that is the trauma that's building up. So let's say if we're not paying attention to that and we're not mindful of the trauma that we're causing, this is how we begin to overwork the skin, which is why I feel it's really hard to overwork the skin. I kind of feel like we really have to go out of our way and not pay attention to what we're doing to overwork the skin. On this part, I'm using the 20% from the Dynamic Pre-Made Gray Wash set, and I'm lining this petal of the rose right here. The reason being is because when I'm done shading, that line is not going to be noticeable. All of that line is going to be where the darkest area starts, and then it's going to whip out and go into a lighter direction. And even as I'm lining right here, I'm not going for complete saturation. I'm not going for a dark, clean line. What I'm going for is kind of like a boundary, a light line that can guide me along the way, that can also disappear as I'm developing this tattoo. I did make an in-depth video on why and how I go about using ghost lines, and that is available on my YouTube channel. Just head on over to my video section, search up ghost lines in my video section on my YouTube channel, and you'll see the video pop up. This isn't necessarily a part of the Stipple whip pepper shading application. This is just more so a step in the process that I take to complete shading on specific designs. So again, these lines are acting as the darkest points of where I want the darkest points to be, and then I'm going to start whipping off from these lines so that way I can make a gradient from the darkest point where this line starts to some open skin. Allow me to show you another example. So you're going to see right here where I did the ghost line a little while ago. Now what I'm doing is I'm building off of this ghost line, and I'm basically establishing the darkest area. So the area where I'm laying down these pixels right now is going to be the darkest area, and it's going to transition down the petal into a lighter area. For example, you see that I'm starting in this area and I'm using simple whip motions to create that transition and shading effect, and then I'm using cross hatching to smooth out the shading. And in a nutshell, that is essentially the application process. I always start by identifying my darker and lighter areas, and then I begin to apply those areas, whether I use ghost lining and or just simple whip shading, stipple shading, pepper shading. I like to use cross hatching as well to smooth out my shading. What I'm saying is, if there are certain parts of the design that are going to be better for whip shading, then whip shade that part of the design. If there's going to be certain parts of the design that require you and that would be better fit for a pendulum motion throughout that part of the design, then use the pendulum motion to get that part of the design done. You kind of get the idea. You have different elements to work with to better fit certain specific parts of designs. This is around my second or third time working this area of the design, and you can see that I'm still experiencing next to no swelling and very minimal redding going on around the skin. It's still early on within this tattoo right here, and if I were to be experiencing redness, swelling, and a lot of bleeding already at this point throughout the tattoo, I would say that I'm off to a very bad start. I still have the rest of the tattoo to go, and the skin is already reacting in ways that make my job more difficult. Let's say you are earlier on in your session and you are experiencing these negative side effects. Then one of the best things that we can probably do is to understand that our technical application may not be correct, or there's probably something that we're doing wrong. Maybe our voltage is too high and our hand speed's too slow. Maybe we're using the needle tip a little too hard. There's a lot that goes into it, because we have to keep in mind, even client skin is going to fluctuate. Some client skin is going to be a little bit more tougher. Some clients may even have more softer skin. So we have to be able to adapt. We have to be able to know how to adapt when certain situations arise. I also feel that we're a lot more equipped to adapt to certain situations when we have the correct technical application under our belt. I know that you've seen me work on this part of the design quite a bit already, and you can see that I'm experiencing a little bit of redness going on right there at the very tip of the petal. However, there's very little swelling, and there's also next to no bleeding going on. Don't forget that I'm using just the very tip of my needle, and I'm also running my setup at 4 volts even. So not only am I very mindful of my technical application and using the tip of my needle, I'm also running at a very low voltage. In terms of the dynamic tones that I am using throughout this tattoo does fluctuate. Often I find myself dipping back for the 40 and 80. I use 40 to kind of establish the areas where I want my dark shading to be. And once I've comfortably established those areas and boundaries, I'll go back in with the 80 to kind of finalize everything. I'll even go back with the 20 and 40 to cross hatch as well to kind of give it that smooth shaded look. After going over this area several times, you're going to see at the tip of the petal, I am now experiencing a little bit of redness going on, which is completely normal. I have gone over this area about maybe 4 to 7 times. I can't be exact, but this area has definitely been worked on. Here's a good example as to why I cross hatch. So you're going to see after I reach the end of this petal, I'm going to go back from this whipping out motion to a more so right and left motion to add another layer of shading over the area that I just applied. So you're going to see right here that I'm going to start shading in the opposite direction in which I was just shading in. And this is so that I get, again, that smooth shading while being able to reach the darkest points that I want to reach. I feel like shading really is going back to the basics. So once we start learning about how to use the very tips of our needles, once we start aligning our hand speed and voltage, and once we start getting more familiar with the technical process of applying shading, things start aligning for us. When we are not familiar with the technical side of shading, when we are not familiar with an approach with shading, when we're not familiar with the tools that we are using, when we're trying to apply shading, then the results are going to be sparse, sporadic, and probably undesirable. When I think about lining, I think about depositing ink into the skin. When I think about shading, I think about brushing ink into the skin. I feel that brushing and depositing of ink into the skin both have a completely different approach and should be treated differently. Going back to hand speed and voltage, let's say if I was moving a little too quick for my machine to deposit pixels in a consistent manner, well, what's going to happen is over time as I'm layering my shading, there's going to be spotty blotches, there's going to be spots in between my pixels. And again, the faster that I'm moving, the less time that the needle is making its rounds to deposit the ink. So I feel what's going to happen is when I'm moving too fast, my pixels are going to be further spaced apart. So when I apply the first layer, I'm going to have pixels with a certain distance in between one another. And then when I apply the next layer, let's say if I'm cross hatching, the same thing, I'm going to have pixels that are too far apart. So what's going to happen is I feel that my shading is going to look a lot more spotty, a lot less consistent, and a lot less smooth. So the speed that we are going to be moving our hand to apply each individual pixel is very important. The same hand speed and voltage that I start my shading with is typically the same hand speed and voltage that I'm going to finish my shading with. For me personally, I don't feel like there's any specific set rules that say this part has to be a whip shade, this part has to be a pendulum. You get the idea, this part has to be dot work. There's no specific handbook or rule guide that tells us what part of the design requires what type of shading. This is going to be 110% solely up to us as the artist. This is going to be 110% on the artist to decide how they want to apply the shading. I used to be very uncomfortable with shading, and I used to not really know what I was doing because I didn't know that I had to align my hand speed and voltage. I didn't know how to use brush-like motions. I didn't know how to use the tip of my needle. I didn't know that I should use different gray washes. I didn't know a lot of different things. And because I didn't know these things, it resulted in me being very, very nervous at the idea of shading. It resulted in my shading coming out very inconsistent, and it resulted in me being faced with an overwhelming feeling of defeat. I feel like shading is a technique that's heavily relied on the basics such as hand speed and voltage, needle depth. Shading heavily relies on these basic fundamentals. So if we don't really have those down and or we're still learning them, then shading may seem like a daunting, stressful, scary thing to do. But I assure you, if you're just patient, you practice the correct techniques and things that you should practice on your end, shading will start lightening up and seem a lot easier over time. When it comes to knowing how to pick different tones for different areas, that all comes down to the reference that I'm looking at and or the way that I envision the specific tattoo design. When it comes to shading, as I've mentioned, it's about layering. So me personally, the artistic approach that I would rather take is to start with, let's say, a 20 or 40% pre-made dynamic gray wash and then work my way up to the darkest point. I would much rather have a lighter area and work it up to a darker area than go too dark too quickly. We have to keep in mind that we can always layer and add more pigment to make certain areas darker. However, we cannot remove. So with that logic and understanding, I feel that it's better to start lighter and build up to the darkness that we want to achieve as opposed to going too dark too quickly. Here's another good example as to why hand speed and voltage and needle depth are important when it comes to shading. When we have these elements combined and working in unison together, we start to get clean, consistent results across the entire tattoo. Shading has a few aspects that are very important that should be aligned in order to achieve smooth, clean, consistent shading. I do feel that when we're shading, we should also not only be aligning our technical approach, but also our artistic approach. We have to know where we want the darker and lighter points within our shading, as that is what's going to make up the final read of the tattoo. One of my secrets to getting clean shading is to focus on the pixel spacing and the consistency between each and every line that I'm pulling. So each and every line that I pull creates a series of different pixels. And the next line that I pull, I want it to be close to the neighboring line as possible. But you are going to see that no matter what part of the tattoo that I'm working on, the same approach pretty much pops up and applies to any part of the tattoo. I'm always starting with identifying my shading placement. I like to start with my darker areas and work towards the light, as you can see me doing here, and that's where I start. And then from there I just work and focus on the technical application, layering up those tones so that way I reach the desired tones that I want. Just to confirm, I never really focus on the amount of passes that I make over a certain part. I don't like keep a set number in my head of how many passes or times I've gone over a certain area. I just use my eyes and I can see when I'm putting too much work into a specific part of the skin. And I kind of feel this is the best approach as to working through anticipation. Shading can be a very nerve-wracking process. Shading alone could be a very scary process, especially if we're not familiar with any of these fundamentals or anything that I've mentioned here in this video. Then shading probably seems next to impossible. Here's a perfect example of what I'm talking about. You're gonna see this part that I'm working right here, it does have some redness going on. However, my thought process is not to be focusing on the redness. My thought process is more so focusing on the final result of the area that I'm working. I'm trying to reach a specific level of darkness while having transitions going in specific directions, and that's my focus. My focus is the technical application. I'm not focused on overworking the skin, and I'm not focused on the more nervous side of shading. I try to keep my shading approach basic, simple, fundamental. Another important thing that I like to remember is to not try to be the best or anything like this. What I try to do is the best that I can do with the current skill sets and capabilities that I have. So allow me to give you a quicker recap. Some variables to focus on, and you may want to write these down as well. Some variables to consider when it comes to shading are the inks that you're using. Instead of going for straight black tattoo ink, try to use a pre-made gray wash set. Like in this case, I'm using the dynamic pre-made gray wash set. Try to use that so that way you get more accurate tones throughout each and every tattoo that you do. Aside from picking out a gray wash ink that is right for you, you're going to want to get familiar with the setup that you are using. Getting comfortable with the setup that you are using will allow you to use it more artistically and will allow you to be more in tune with the results that you're going to be getting. So once you've picked out your ink that's right for you, once you've got your setup that's right for you, you now want to find out your hand speed and voltage. Figure out where you're comfortable on the voltage spectrum. Start lower and then work your way up. I would recommend trying not to go too high when it comes to shading, so that way you have more time to work on the skin while causing less trauma when you are working on the skin. Another thing that always helps is to get real comfortable with the needle selection that you choose. How comfortable we are with our needles and gear we choose to use, I feel, is a direct contribution to how confident we are going to be throughout the tattoo sessions. So if we're using gear that we are not truly familiar with, we can't really anticipate and or expect familiar results. If you are getting into shading and you feel like you're not going to learn it, you feel like it's maybe an impossible task, or it's just something that you simply cannot do, I would recommend to be very patient with yourself and give yourself the time to mess up, give yourself the time to practice, and not only that, be kind to yourself along the way. We have to remember that shading is on the more advanced end of tattooing. We have to be kind, we have to be patient, and we have to remember that shading is not something that's necessarily easy. I feel that lining is a bit more direct and straightforward over shading, although they both do have their learning curves. So remember that shading is more on the advanced side of tattooing, so be patient, be kind to yourself throughout the learning process. Please note that in this video, I'm focused more on the technical side of applying shading and not so much focused on shading placement. Be sure to hit that subscribe button and ring that bell for me, as I will be bringing more in-depth videos on various aspects of shading. For this video, I wanted to stick to the technical fundamental side of shading. We're also doing stipple whip pepper shading in this video. We are going to make another video where we focus more on smooth shading for like realism, portraits, things of this nature. So again, be sure to stick around for that. Here is a top view of the tattoo in its completed form. In my opinion, I was able to get nice, clean, consistent shading, and I do love the textures that this shading gave me as well. I want to give you a close-up look at this tattoo so that way you can see everything close up. I want you to see the textures. I want you to see all of the details and everything that I did here, and I want you to see the final results so that way you can get a good idea as to know what you can expect when you stipple whip pepper shade on your end. Let's keep in mind that this tattoo is in fact fresh. There's no bleeding going on. There's very little redness going on as well. So for me personally, for this to be a fresh tattoo and for it to look the way that it looks, we're experiencing minimal redness. We're experiencing minor or next to no swelling at all. I personally feel that the technical application was on point. I'm sure a lot of us are wondering how this sort of shading style heals. Well, allow me to show you this exact same tattoo about 3 to 4 months in and healed. Here is the same tattoo about 3 to 4 months into healing, and you can see that the integrity held up over that time. All of my lighter areas are still there, all of my darker areas are still there, and overall the tattoo healed just the way that I would have wanted my tattoo to heal. The healing results that I experienced here let me know that the technical application was on point. I'm very happy with these results and I love the way that this rose reads. I feel like this would be a great place to conclude the video. If you have any questions at all, I'm going to encourage you to drop a comment down below and I will do my absolute best to assist you in the best possible direction. Please don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel and ring that bell for me, as I'm going to be bringing more videos like this for you all. I do have social medias under the same name as my YouTube channel. I have Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok all under the same name as my YouTube at Daniel Yuck. I would truly appreciate the support over there as well. If you enjoy my channel and find my content helpful, consider becoming a Patreon or sending over a super thanks, as I would greatly appreciate your support. Thank you for your time. I appreciate you watching. You have a great day.